The Athletic.
Are Red Bull's upgrades enough to fight off McLaren? What's it like to be on the pit wall when team orders go wrong? And are aerodynamic testing restrictions closing the pack? Gary talks all that and more. Welcome to another episode of the Race F1 Tech Show with me, Edd Straw, but far more significantly, we also have our very own ex-F1 technical director, Gary Anderson, here to tell you all about the latest talking points in Grand Prix racing. So hello, Gary. I know you don't have favourites, as you quite happily judge every team with equal frankness, I think it's fair to say, but are you pleased to see your old team McLaren back on top?
Yeah, I mean, it's great to see another team there for sure. That's the important thing. I know, it's great for McLaren. It's a long time since I was at McLaren, but and they're a very different McLaren nowadays. But still, they do carry that name. It's a bit like Williams in its own little way. They're part of what Formula One is, and it's great to see them up at the front end again, battling. And it does look like they've got a car for all conditions, all circuits. So I think they've done a fantastic job since the sort of that little bit of a Honda era, I suppose you might call it, in the teens, 2000 teens. So I think it's great to see them get there, and they're obviously building for the future as well, because they do have two young, very, very competent drivers, and the future looks bright for them. They just got to keep on the development route, because these regulations stay more or less the same for 2025. So I can see them being getting a good start in 2025, being a real contender for championships.
It's interesting, isn't it, to look at the way McLaren's developing, because obviously when you were at McLaren, chief mechanic among other roles, that was the Teddy Mayer-led period, which was kind of the period that followed the loss of Bruce McLaren, and then you had the next phase, which was the Ron Dennis with the Project 4 merger, and seen as kind of the glory years of McLaren, and then they've had the dip and they've come back, so it's almost like building up a new team, isn't it? It's all about learning how to win, and that's why I think that 1-2 was so important, despite all of the shenanigans going on. Just to be able to go there and dominate first and second from the front row of the grid is something that you don't do by accident.
Well, to be honest, getting on the front row of the grid 1-2 in equal circumstances, I think is a pretty good effort, and then to be able to do that in the race as well just shows how all round the car they have and all round the driver they have. They're able to wring its neck in a one-lap qualifying, and they're able to drive in a conservative mode, I think you might call it, which is what you have to do with these Grand Prix cars, but conservative enough to outdrive the other guys who are driving in conservative mode. So I think they've got a good understanding, and it's as I say, it's a very different McLaren from the old days, the Ron Dennis days or the Teddy Mayer days. And it's, they keep saying it's a young team. Yes, it is a young team. There are still people there from my day, so it's not that young. But on the pit wall and, around the garage as such, they are all pretty young and wouldn't say inexperienced by any means, but they're learning every day. They've never really been in this situation. So it's a learning curve for everybody, including the drivers.
Yeah, it's all about becoming battle-hardened, isn't it, and learning how to be familiar with being at the front of the grid, and it just all becoming a little bit easier. And I suspect that might connect to what you will probably choose for your choice of topic for the first part of the podcast. So what should we delve into?
Yeah, I think the McLaren pit strategy thing is a situation that we should look at, because, it got so much column inches, I suppose you might call it. It was obviously one of those situations where they probably did the wrong thing in pitting Lando before Piastri. But they did it for the right reasons at that point in time. And that, Piastri was told he would be let through again because the undercut in Hungary is so powerful. So it was one of those situations. I think if you lead up to it a little bit, Piastri made a mistake and lost sort of 2 seconds to Norris. If he hadn't made that mistake and got one wheel in the gravel out of turn 12, I think he would have had a big enough gap for Norris to have done that stop and still come out after his stop in the lead. But he didn't. He made a mistake, lost a couple of seconds. It went down from like 4 seconds to under 2 even. So that was potentially, I think, where Lando Norris would have seen, perhaps I can actually win this on merit, and obviously then calling him into the pits and giving him the early stop meant that the undercut was very, very powerful, and they got ahead of Piastri. But at that point in time, they told Piastri they would switch them, so they didn't actually tell Norris that, I don't think. So at the end of the day, it was a bit a slight naivety, I suppose, on the pit wall. At trying to organise something that a situation that they'd created themselves, or trying to reorganise a situation they'd created themselves. And I think they made a bit of a mess of that. It's very difficult to be a driver's engineer and give him bad news over the telephone as such, because that's not how you should do it. You should be going out for a beer with your driver and discussing just a working relationship. I always think it's very hard for Verstappen and his engineer, because Verstappen's very black and white, and he says what he thinks on the radio, and sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad. But at the end of the day, I think with McLaren, they are all a friendly bunch, and it's always difficult for the engineer to bring that bad news. I think they needed somebody else in the pit wall to actually make that call to Lando, to say, Lando, you have to do this now. Somebody fairly senior in the engineering level. They didn't do that. They left it to his engineer to tell him. And at the end of the day, they spend their life debating stuff between them, and it showed that that was the wrong thing to do. You do need somebody that puts your foot down and says, "This is what we're doing, Lando. So just do it."
And obviously, as you say, there's been lots of column inches, lots of people talking about it, but you're in a particularly unusual position amongst those commenting on it, in that you have sat on that pit wall yourself. You've faced slightly unresponsive or perhaps uncooperative drivers in such scenarios. So what's it actually like if you're sat on the pit wall and you get a sense that you have a driver who might not comply with the instructions? Could you share some of the increasing concern that seemed to be coming through in the radio messages to Norris?
Yeah, I think you can. I mean, obviously, he's a young Grand Prix driver. He's won one Grand Prix. He should probably have won another 2 or 3, but he hasn't, for one reason or another. So it's one of those sort of situations where he's in the lead, has the for sure potential to win that Grand Prix. It's the last thing he wants to do is give it up. And at the end of the day, I think it was good in one way, because it showed that McLaren don't have a defined number one. They definitely are treating both drivers with equal status, which is great, because we will see them race. If you've got 2 good drivers and a good car, they're 99.9% of the time they're going to be together on the track. The thing is, they've got to respect each other. So hopefully that will not lead to any disrespect. We had it at Jordan, I suppose you might call it. Eddie Irvine and Rubens Barrichello, they weren't best buddies by any means. Giancarlo Fisichella, Ralf Schumacher, they weren't best buddies. Damon Hill and Ralf Schumacher weren't best buddies. And they did silly things at times, but it's in the heat of the moment, I think that the situation with Norris and Piastri was a little bit different. That was simmering over, I don't know, what was 15 laps probably. The fact that they didn't know whether Norris was going to let him through or not. So that's why I say they need somebody fairly senior within it, that when he says turn left, that's what people do. And if he had got on the phone and told Norris to let Piastri through, then that's what I think they should have done, because they were all driving to manage their tyres. They were all driving to get to the checkered flag at that point in time. Piastri was told before that second stop that he was going to be let through again. So, he didn't go out and just drive the wheels off the car. He drove knowing that he was protecting his tyres as best possible. So everything led to a situation that they created for themselves. And you've been there. The thing is that whenever you're on the pit wall, there's nothing you can do but to make solid, justified and hard decisions. And that's why I say they need somebody, upper management, not just the race engineer, to do that.
Yeah, I'm sure Andrea Stella was gearing up to give an explicit instruction had Norris not responded, but that would have left it quite late. But obviously, this is a technical podcast, and this is a human thing. And it's always one of those big challenges, isn't it? Because as a strategist, as a team, you want to win the race, minimise the race time, make it nice and straightforward. And that seemed to be the dominant decision that was made in terms of the order they did the pit stops in that created the situation. Do you sometimes have to just say, well, that is the absolute optimum, but we've got some leeway. We can maybe even bring Piastri in a little bit earlier than we would have liked, so Norris doesn't get the undercut on him, even if there are concerns about the last stint? Do you just say, we think we've got enough margin to take a little bit of a hit, just not to create this situation? Do you have to let that thought of the human element override, to an extent, the strategic element, given it was they were still in a strong position whatever happened? They just reversed the order in order to cover off any lingering threat of an undercut to the both from behind?
Yeah. I mean, I think they did panic a little bit, I suppose, to cover that, to cover Norris off from Hamilton. And I think if you look at the gaps, there was definitely leeway to not panic. And they could have called Oscar in, as you say, a lap earlier, and then Norris in the next lap. Because, there was time there. It might have got a little bit close, and if they'd screwed up a pit stop, maybe they would have got caught. But that's life. You have to have, you can't sort of cover yourself for all of that stuff. You have to sometimes take the gamble. And I always believe that the lead driver should get the best call. And if that is Piastri, if he says he doesn't want to do it, that's okay. I think Norris would have said he didn't want to do it if they had took Piastri in first, because he would have tried to have got his head down and got a big enough gap to Piastri. It wouldn't probably have worked because, as I say, the undercut is quite strong. The new tyres are better than the old tyres, so I don't think it would have worked. But he could have tried that. And I think that's what he was a bit upset about more than anything, was the fact that the team had taken away the fact that he could go racing with Piastri in those last 20 laps. If they had done the normal thing, and even if they left it the way it was, with as I say, Piastri pitting first and then Norris, there would still have been maybe a couple of second gap, but at least then they were still going racing. Whereas when he went out there with whatever laps it was left after his pit stop, and he was told to swap positions, he couldn't go for the race win. And you think maybe, well, if he had done it immediately, if he'd swapped positions immediately, he'd had a lot more laps to have had a go. But I think the team would have shut that down in the fact that Piastri led off the line, led a big margin of the race. So really, he was to be honest, he was the true winner. I hope this doesn't sort of dilute Piastri's win, because it was an exceptional job. And it shouldn't dilute it, just the fact that he was let through, because to me, he was the justified winner of that race.
Well, that's exactly the thing, isn't it? I certainly don't think it dilutes it, because if you make the argument that Norris should have been allowed to race the final stint and stay ahead if he could, you also therefore have to say, well, in that case, Piastri should have had the chance to have the pit stop priority, which is what he'd earned. That's the rule. Whoever's ahead on track has priority in the pit stop calls. Or at the very least, even if you did it the other way round, Piastri would have not gone 2 laps longer. So you can't sort of say Norris can race when you've given him those advantages, and Piastri hasn't been allowed to race through that phase. So, yeah, as you say, they'd committed to that kind of approach as soon as they swapped round the pit stop priority and given that 2-lap undercut. But it's very complicated sort of situation. I guess it illustrates that overcomplicating things when it comes to strategy often causes you problems, doesn't it?
Yes, it's very easy to do that. And I mean, the big thing is that you should go into every given weekend knowing who will get priority. If such a thing, the guy leading, for example, would get priority, or the guy ahead of his teammate would get priority at any point in time. And that's what they should know. So I don't disagree with them trying to pull Norris in and make sure he was protected against Hamilton, but they should have given Piastri that opportunity. And if he had said, no, I don't want to do it, then do it with Norris. That's okay. And if the circumstances worked out the way it did, then they're racing because you've given them the opportunity, but they didn't do that. So I think they'll learn a lot from this. As I say, a young McLaren as such, it will they'll grow a lot from this. They are now in the need of being a team that can make decisions on the pit wall and stick by them. So, if they're going to win lots of races, you've got to be able to do that. Once they get over the excitement of having won 2 or 3 Grand Prix, they will, I think they will sort of settle down and be able to make more logical decisions.
Let's move on to the main topic of the podcast now, Gary, which is the Red Bull upgrade. A huge talking point in Hungary, a significantly revised bodywork package for Max Verstappen. It's very rare to see such a visually obvious change. So why do you think Red Bull has gone that way?
It's difficult to know, to be honest. I have to say that, from the outside, I'd look at it and say that Red Bull are maybe missing the influence of Adrian Newey at this point in time, and they're doing things in a different way, because, they talked about high-speed, low-speed circuits, all that sort of stuff about one package for one circuit, another package for another one. But, at Hungary, it's a low-speed track. There's a few high-speed corners, but it's a low-speed track. And they had one car in one specification and one car in another specification. It's the other bits that make you wonder what they've done. And part of that's the front wing. But we'll come to that in a second. But the visual part is never really the big part. Obviously, they've looked at trying to reduce that blockage cross-sectional area in front of the rear wing. So you would say that potentially the Max Verstappen solution had a better aerodynamic characteristics to get the flow to a high downforce rear wing assembly. But in reality, every wing needs as good a flow to it as possible. So if those elephant trunks, as I call them, are blockage to the rear wing, then the blockage to the rear wing in Spa, in Suzuka, in all those high-speed tracks as well. So you've got to sort of package it to suit the best package. And unless they've got real cooling problems, then I don't see why you would change it. And I think Hungary showed they didn't have real cooling problems because they ran one car one specification, one car another specification. So I don't understand their logic. But going on to the other solutions that they've done, the front wing, I think from the comments that we hear, especially from Verstappen, but the actual fact of Perez struggling a bit, for me it's this front wing flexing situation. The car was released initially with the adjuster for the front wing flaps inboard, so it's quite close to the nose. So basically, because they're not supported at the outboard end, only on a pivot, the two rear flaps could bend downwards. The outboard end could bend downwards, and the inboard end would offer consistent flow to the leading edge of the underfloor, which is very important. But the outboard end of the front wing doesn't create very much downforce. So I believe that it was, in high speed, the amount that it flexed wasn't enough to lose the front downforce to move the centre of pressure rearwards. So for Hungary, they moved the adjuster outboard, so it was the inboard end of the wing that was flexing. And for the same given amount of flex, in millimetres, let's say for 5 millimetres flex, you will reduce the front downforce by quite a substantial amount more. So I think their effort to get low speed front end grip and then high speed rear end consistency, that's what they're trying to achieve with that. I don't think they've got there yet, because all the complaints in Hungary from Max was about, we had too much understeer, but the rear wasn't secure enough. So I think that's the same situation. They just don't have enough centre of pressure shift from low speed to high speed. So I think they'll be working on that. And one of the areas that I've always thought was a bit strange was the nose to the front wing. Having that slot gap going right across that front part, it just means the turning moment you have to put on the airflow underneath the nose is reduced dramatically, because you've got that slot gap right underneath the nose itself. I wouldn't be surprised to see that appear sometime. But they're obviously looking to try to get this low-speed to high-speed balance, which they've done very well over the last couple of years. But unless it's there, Perez doesn't like it, makes mistakes, and Max is fairly vocal on the radio. So, what he was saying about it, to me, read that that's the thing they're still looking for. And the other bit of the bodywork, engine cover and all that is, I think that's just a development to reduce the cross-sectional area to try and make the rear wing work better. And again, if you can make the rear wing work better, in high speed, the rear wing will work better. So the car will be more stable. So it's a circle of events that you could write the script for, all to achieve the same thing, which is low-speed front-end grip and high-speed rear-end grip.
It's worth noting as well that in terms of running that front wing, Perez obviously didn't have the bodywork section, the rear bodywork changes, but he did have that new front wing, and he felt a lot happier with the consistency and the feel of the car. He said that the Friday was the best Friday he had of the season, and although he obviously had that crash in qualifying, which compromised his weekend, he took a little bit too much curb. We knew it should have been damn stupid mistake and not helpful for his cause. But I actually think he was quicker. And if you look at his race, he actually did a pretty good recovery drive to 7th, kept Russell behind throughout the race. And if you look at his race pace compared to Verstappen, slightly different kinds of races, so not perfect comparisons, but his race pace was perfectly decent. And I think there were signs of improvement there, and that seems to tie in with what you've been talking about there, all those characteristic gains. And in fact, it was the thing you said when you first looked at that wing right at the beginning of the weekend before we even knew Perez was happier. You felt it would help Perez. So that all seems quite logical.
Yeah, I mean, I look at it from a sort of what the challenge would be if I was involved, what I'd be trying to get from the cars. I look at them all with that sort of philosophy, because I've been involved with it. I've been confronted with trying to find solutions to problems, and I still sort of work with that everything. I never go and buy anything. I always think I can make it better. But again, with the car, I think it's difficulty for Perez. He can't handle this nervous rear end at high speed. It can live with a little bit of the understeer at low speed, but it's only a little bit, because understeer just makes you go slower. That's all. You can't overcome understeer. It can give you confidence to a certain degree, but you need to have understeer. You need to have understeer with grip. I think it's a very different thing from just understeer. If you have understeer, you just turn the steering wheel, and the car goes straight on as such. And you put more steering lock on it, and the car goes straight on. Then you've just got understeer. But if you can have a little bit of understeer, but as you put more steering lock on, you actually get more front grip. That for me would be the big thing I'd be looking for. And that's what the driver really wants. I think he just gets confused because if you just got black and white understeer, the driver can't do anything about it. Whereas if you get understeer with grip, the driver can actually use his talent to overcome that situation, and then it can have a car that's got a good secure rear end in high-speed corners. So, that will help Perez, that type of solution in the car. It'll help Max as well. The fact that Max can live with the other bit, the nervous rear end, means that they don't maybe prioritise it as much as they should. So I think, sometimes you get a driver that can drive with a situation that means you don't actually get your head down and try and fix the real problem, because the driver can drive around it. And I think they're caught up in that situation, and they have been caught up in that situation for quite a while.
Returning to the wider bodywork thing, obviously you said you couldn't see the logic in some of it. I'm interested in this desire to switch between specs, because that one, as well as being better for the high cooling demand, does seem to generate more downforce as well. So the idea seems to be that for tracks like Hungary, they run that package. Spa, it would be logical to run the older package. In fact, Perez did say that they'd be both running the older package there. Pierre Vacher, the technical director there, asked him about this in the press conference, because there have been all sorts of suggestions about this happening. He said, yeah, it's possible, and it's down to the track characteristics and cooling demand. And he said it's just like we do with other parts. We change things around according to the track characteristics. Now, you're obviously significantly more adept at aerodynamics than I am, and for me, I see the logic of that argument, but it must make such a profound difference to the way the whole aero map of the car is working. This is a huge thing to switch between, surely, in terms of the impact it has on the rest of the car. I can see the potential in having two different packages, but that feels like they're biting off a hell of a lot there. And the question is, can they actually chew it technically? If any team can, it can be Red Bull. But that seems hugely complex. Is it simpler than perhaps I'm thinking it is, or would you be worried about that aspect?
Well, I don't think it's simple, no. I think that just making up the decisions as to what you run for every circuit on the car, you got a package of decisions to make. Brakes, for example, does the circuit, what sort of brake cooling do you need? And I'm sure the radiators are different here and there for different circuits. The cooling outlets would be different for every circuit. So you've got this package of bits, which I do understand that you do differently. Obviously, just the mechanical setup as well. But the more you sort of have to make decisions on, the less you can focus on making the right decisions on the bits that are really important. And I don't really understand the logic of saying that the bodywork that Verstappen had on the car gave more rear downforce. Because you want more rear downforce anywhere. Because if you can drop the rear wing off by a degree or whatever, or a size of rear wing, because the flow to it's better, then that's what you want to do. It doesn't matter what circuit you're at. So I don't really buy into that philosophy at all. As I say, I don't really buy into the philosophy that it would cool better. I can't see the logic in that one. Because again, you want the best cooling everywhere you go, because any airflow you're using for cooling is airflow you're wasting for downforce. So the argument doesn't make sense to me. I'm sure they will probably arrive, as Perez says it, in Spa with the two old sets of bodywork on the car. But I would say I have no idea why you do that. Because, as I say, you want rear downforce, you want optimized cooling, no matter what circuit you're at. So I don't see the logic in saying that the old bodywork was better for everything, whenever they say they can get more downforce with the new bodywork. So, yeah, that's a question mark to me. And as I say, maybe they're just missing Adrian Newey to put some logic into the situation again.
Looking at the broad picture for Red Bull, they do seem to have a car, and they've had for a while, one that's got quite a narrow window where it can be very, very quick, but it's quite hard to get it in that window in terms of balance, the ride, all those kinds of things. Do you think that they might have a concept that's perhaps got a slightly lower ceiling than some of those around them? Or do you think that in these regs there is that option to go with something that's a little bit more narrow, windy and peaky in the Red Bull direction with that quite harsh mechanical platform? And there's also the other way when you go the McLaren direction to get quite a nice all-rounder, but maybe doesn't quite have that peak of pace. But when the Red Bull can't be in that window, that it is the quicker car. Do you see any pattern emerging, or do we have to wait a little bit longer to make any conclusions on that score?
I think we need to wait a little bit longer. It does look like that. I think the best all-round car at the minute for me looks like the McLaren. It's just a package that the drivers can get in and use. Low speed, high speed. Maybe when we get to Monza, maybe they won't have the efficiency, but that'll be a different problem. But it does look like the Red Bull of this year hasn't really followed the same path as the Red Bull of the last 2 years. I know they dominated the last 2 years, and it's easy to say that they really understood the car, but I think this year they have dug a hole for themselves, and maybe they've just gone down that peaky downforce route that's really, really difficult to get on top of. It wouldn't surprise me because, when you get to a situation where you've dominated it for 2 years, you want to keep that domination going, and sometimes maybe the decisions that you make are not the correct decisions. And the thing is about regrouping and fixing it. And again, this is something about Adrian Newey I always felt. Adrian always had confidence in where he wanted to get to. It's a bit like when they had the blown exhaust, the exhaust blowing on the rear brake ducts to create downforce there. Initially it didn't work. But he still believed in it, and he pursued it until it did work. And when it did work after 3 or 4 races, Vettel was a rocket ship. But prior to that, whenever it wasn't working, Mark Webber was the rocket ship. So it's about believing in a step that you can make and really pursuing making that happen. And I think they miss Adrian for that, for sure, because now Red Bull have become, I suppose you might call it, another team. They're just working on the car in the same manner as the rest of the teams, Mercedes, McLaren, Ferrari. They're not sort of doing anything exceptional. They're just doing the same thing as them, just trying to develop the car and find more downforce. And that can lead you just to peaky downforce.
And I guess when you're looking at the other teams, particularly Mercedes and McLaren, they'll be quite hopeful that this could be a proper change in terms of the balance of power. So if you were one of those teams, and even Ferrari, who are going through this porpoising struggle, but they're not too far behind, and they will have a package after the break that will solve it completely. They had a small floor tweak in the underfloor for Hungary that was meant to mitigate it, but that was never an absolute fix, and that seems to have had a small effect, but nothing much, but it was never meant to. But you'll be thinking, if you're Mercedes or McLaren, and even Ferrari, despite those problems, that next year this is all up for grabs. McLaren could win the Constructors this year, conceivably, but a couple of months ago you'd have bet the farm on Red Bull winning the championship next year. But now it's even possible they might not even have parity. They could end up not being the top team next year.
Yeah, it is true. Again, I'm never quite a big believer in a team like Ferrari saying, "Oh yeah, we'll have a package by the after the summer break, they'll fix all our problems." I always try to say, well, let's wait and see. But yeah, the Red Bull of today doesn't look like a good place to put your understanding in for the Red Bull of tomorrow, for next year. It's one of these things where, I think the last 2 years, 22, 23, they came through that with confidence, and they could do anything they wanted, really. And I think we saw that in the car whenever it first appeared this year. We thought, oh, that's a big step. And a big and logical step, a lot of it. So it looked like it was done with confidence at that point in time. But some of it obviously wasn't the right direction. And, you need to be able to step back and look at it and fix it. And I'm not seeing that within Red Bull at the moment. I know they're still up there, they're still scoring good points, and they've won more races than anybody else this year. But at the end of the day, I'm not seeing the confidence that's digging them out of that hole of being, maybe second, third, maybe even fourth team if they had a clean sheet of paper and tried to put a package together for next year's car. There'd definitely be a lot of confusion as to what they were going to try and build. So I think it's interesting. I think it's good for the sport. Is it bad for Red Bull? Probably. They want to do better. But us sitting at home watching it, we want to see racing, and we're getting racing, and that's all we can ask for.
Exactly, yeah. Ideally, all four of those teams vying on equal terms would be the dream. But certainly those concerns about Red Bull are shared by Verstappen, and his annoyance was very obvious to everybody. But behind the scenes, he's been pushing on this for quite some time in terms of being concerned about the ride problems in particular. They can no longer give away a little bit of ride height in order to make the car a bit more drivable, and they're just pushing up against problems. And you could see that if you watched the car's onboards in qualifying through the chicane. The Verstappen in the Red Bull was going over the curbs, sort of rattling over them, whereas Norris was gliding over them. That's not a driver thing. That's a car mechanical platform characteristic, isn't it? That's something you can't do anything about as a driver. You've got what you've got. Yeah, you have, and you've got to drive it in the best way possible. And if you're maximising the grip level as far as your feeling in the car is concerned, then all you can try and do is make the track a bit shorter, and that means climbing the curbs a bit more. There's a fine line between hitting the curb a little bit and hitting the curb a lot. Sometimes you have to hit it a lot because the top of the curb's flat, whereas the side of the curb's got a bit of an angle on it. And if you hit the angle, it throws you across the road. So you have to, say, if the car doesn't ride the curbs well, it'll by doing it a little bit is actually worse than doing it a lot. So it's a fairly strange thing, curbs. But if you can drive over the top of them in the car, it's more when it lands. It wants to land and stop moving. If it sort of has a secondary bounce when it lands, that's when it's a problem, because that's when you want to get the power back on again. And that's when it can bite you very, very easily. So it's not just about what the car looks like on top of the curb. It's that first landing, if the car settles immediately, or if it bounces 2 or 3 times. That makes a massive difference, because you've gone
5 or 6 car lengths down the road before it's stopped doing it. So that's when it's not good. So yeah, the platform, the working of the platform, the stiffness of the car, the aerodynamic profile of the underfloor for ride height, all that stuff, it's all work. You have to work it all out as one now. There's none of it's separated anymore.
Yeah, as an aside on the landing thing, that's one of the problems Sauber have got with their suspension package, that it just doesn't settle well when it hits the ground. So that's holding them back quite significantly. But yeah, lots of problems for Red Bull, and it's going to be a big talking point at Spa this weekend, although Spa obviously should be very good territory, shouldn't it, for Red Bull? Some long straights, we know the car's very good on that in terms of the efficiency, some high-speed corners, good for McLaren as well, but that sort of track feels like somewhere where we should see potentially close to the best of Red Bull, I'd have thought. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think so. I think we'll see the best of all of them as long as the weather plays ball. We keep saying that about races, but then we suddenly see some strange weather characteristic appear. But hopefully Spa, if it's a decent weather, a decent weekend for everybody, then I think we'll come out there with a better picture of who's where and what the problem is for a lot of them. If porpoise is going to be a problem, it'll show up in Spa, and Ferrari will be in a bad state because of it. So that it should highlight the problems that most teams have, but Red Bull should be pretty decent through there.
Yeah, I don't think Ferrari's going to have a great weekend. Even at the Hungaroring, they had to make a little bit of a compromise for the few corners where they got into the speed range where porpoising was a big problem there. So Spa, yeah, is not the sort of territory for them. Some work to do there. Well, it's time now in the show when Gary takes on your questions. If there's something you'd like us to ask Gary, send it to podcasts@therace.com. You can also send us a voice recording to include in the show if you'd like to ask your question directly, which rarely happens, admittedly, but it's a great way to boost the chances of getting into the show, I would say. We've got 4 questions today, so let's pile into them. The first one comes from Connor, who mentions the switching between the engine cover bodywork arrangements. And the question is, are there any historical precedents for teams switching between such visually distinctive bodywork arrangements in the same season for different circuit types? Can you think of any, Gary?
Well, not really a precedent for it, I suppose you might call it. Most teams will change the cooling characteristics of the cars for different circuits because of high speed, low speed, higher ambient, lower ambient. So yeah, there will be that. The engine, the cooling systems and the brake cooling systems will be altered. So I suppose you could package that and say, yeah, it's a different solution. There may be some differences in the rear wing, as we know, the rear beam wing, the front wing assembly again for high downforce, low downforce circuits. So it's where you draw the line at, I suppose. What is important and what isn't important. I don't agree with making it more and more parts, because at the end of the day, you still need all that package of spare parts. You need a lot of stuff just for one specification of car as such. And if you create yourself 2 specifications of car, it just gets more and more difficult. So I don't think there's been a precedent set, but it does happen to quite a degree. And as I said, lots of mechanical stuff also change from circuit to circuit. So there is a big package of stuff, but I couldn't say it's as visual what I've seen before as what Red Bull are proposing.
Yeah, I could think of things like those X-Wings, as they called them, that sprouted up. Or, for example, when Arrows had that tool wing on the nose that briefly appeared that was quite swiftly got rid of. So there's things like that where you get little areas that aren't regulated and you can stick things in. But even that is far less significant than basically the whole engine cover and sort of channel down towards the Coke bottle area. So again, yeah, that's why I feel I'm so interested in how big an impact it has between it. So this is Red Bull pushing it to extremes, but that's what Red Bull does, isn't it? So fascinating to see if that could be a viable direction. The next question is Adam McCloskey, who says, while the list of technical people who used to work at Red Bull is growing, I don't think a lack of smart people is what has allowed McLaren and Mercedes back in the fight. They've been at an aerodynamic testing deficit for nearly 3 years to their competition. Can you discuss the importance of this missing time from being at the top of the championship table, and what role do you think it has played in bringing McLaren and Mercedes right alongside the Red Bull? So this is the aerodynamic testing restrictions that gives you a reduced amount of wind tunnel runs and CFD items based on your championship position. How big a role has that played?
Well, it plays a big role, really, because one of the things you can do, it sort of doesn't stop you having good ideas, but what having more time does for you is being able to exploit those ideas to a higher degree. In other words, you can do more aero map running, for example. You can get more data from the wind tunnel runs, steering, lock, roll, yaw. You can put the car through lots and lots of characteristics that if your tunnel time is reduced, you might not have time to do that. So I think you end up with a better understanding of any development just from the fact of having more time, as opposed to the good ideas that go with it. So I think the two of them go hand in hand, really. You can have the good ideas, as I say, still, no matter, even if you had no wind tunnel time, but you can definitely optimize stuff better with the more wind tunnel and CFD time that you've got. And then that gives you a better understanding, gives you more information to use in your simulator, gives you a wider range of potential setups to run with it. So, yeah, it'll never be a negative to have more wind tunnel time.
Yeah, although I think overall the size of the steps I don't think is big enough to account for it, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Obviously, Red Bull had the extra reduction for the cost cap bust, so they had 12 months worth where they lost a little bit more. So that will have played a part, but there is an argument that some teams make, some of those lower down, this is a position Williams has taken, is that actually the steps aren't big enough and you need to make the ATR really work. You need to shape it based on points scored and that kind of thing. So rather than just being a linear thing in 5% steps, it's something a little bit different. But yeah, I think still the best teams are also often the best teams in terms of the efficiency of that they run it. You know, like you say, it doesn't help. But I don't think if we consider the problems Red Bull are having, that's the reason why they've ended up in this slightly narrow window car with the suspension. So all of these things are different factors, aren't there? And it doesn't make it easy, does it? But it's got to be a gentle factor, and you can't, of course, with the cost cap that's alongside it, spend your way out of trouble. So that's maybe the thing that if you were going in a direction that was problematic, and you're in Red Bull's shoes right now, you might think, we might need to do a complete overhaul of the car for next year that we weren't planning on doing. But that's just not an option with 26 on the horizon, is it? So that's perhaps the area where it's most significant with that problem we were talking about earlier of the 25 competitiveness.
Yeah. I mean, that's, some of these teams will be planning for the future a little bit, but I think it's hard to plan for the future because your results for today is what gives you the motivation. So, yeah, I agree with what Williams was saying about the fact the steps not being big enough. But again, where do you draw the line? It's the tunnel facility or the manpower, the aerodynamic manpower you have needs to be taken into account. The points, the actual out and out performance. There's potentially a big equation you could put together there that would lead you to having a bigger difference in the wind tunnel time. But you can also get too complicated about all that stuff. It's just, it is what it is. And I think it's not done any harm in that it has maybe closed the teams up a little bit. But it's one of those things where the last thing you want to do is say the championship was won because I can't go in the wind tunnel. There'll always be a reason for it, and I don't like that situation.
The next question comes from Ben from Regensburg in Germany, who says, we often hear engineers refer to switches like strat mode when it comes to engine settings. I understand that those influence your torque map, your power, fuel mixture and deploying or harvesting of electrical energy. But what does the tyre switch influence? For example, Norris's engineer told him in the Austrian Grand Prix after suffering a puncture to go to tyre 13. Are these simply predetermined differential settings, or is there more to it?
Well, there is more to it. One of them, the basic thing is the tyre switch. You change between the diameter of the tyres for dry weather tyres to wet weather tyres, but that's obviously wasn't what was happening in Austria. But when you get a puncture, obviously the systems in the car get a little bit confused as to what wheel to believe, because obviously a smaller tyre, because it's got a puncture, will turn more than the other one. So normally, the tyre switch in those sort of circumstances would be to lock the diff. So you can drive home, so the diff doesn't slip and all the punctured tyre just sits there with wheel spin. So it can be to lock the diff, or it could be to believe the the right rear tyre as opposed to the left rear tyre, which some of them have, because obviously sensors can go down. And if you have a sensor going down, then you should, believe the other wheel. So what McLaren have, I don't really know, but that's, tyre 13 could be just the fact that, believe the right rear tyre, or whatever tyre it was, that was still good for the rest of the sensors on the car.
And the final question from Jaap Rutte, who says, if you were to redesign the new regulations single-handedly, what would you change to the 2026 regulations, and how would you do that? A big question, but what's the basic core if you were building the regs, Gary?
Yeah, it's a big question. I mean, I think lighter cars, smaller cars, less tyre would be the sort of main objective. I'm not a big believer in active aero, because I think at the end of the day, you're playing into the teams that can achieve it better. And I think the aerodynamics in these cars is difficult enough to have a good solution to, without having to have it a good solution for whenever the active aero is in play. So I think the active aero I would do away with. I don't like DRS. I would do away with DRS, but I still think if the formula is such that you need a help to overtake, then a boost button using the electrical power wouldn't do any harm. Formula 1 stayed away from that because other formulas do that and they don't want to copy anybody. But it's one of those sort of situations where the weight of the car's got so much because it's so focused on electrical power. And, the current fuels that are around, and the fuel technology and the combustion chamber technology, put a fuel limit on the car. At the minute, we have a fuel limit, amount of fuel you can put in the car at the start of a race. Do something like that as well. So, just making the cars lighter would make them massively different. I think that, we may need to look at something with the brakes as well to increase the braking distances a little bit, because it's in the braking distances that you'll pass somebody. So it's a huge subject, to be honest, and something that whenever these regulations finally get sort of stamped, I think that we'll try and do a comprehensive column on it to try and understand it a bit more.
Yeah, there's plenty of back and forth going on there. But yeah, I think plenty will agree with your overview there. Well, great questions and excellent answers as always. If you've got a question for Gary, podcasts@therace.com to send that through to us. Next time you'll hear from us on the Tech Show will be the August break, so stay with us for more from Gary.
The Athletic.